It was billed as a trial for the history books. Now that the verdict is in for the Charlie Hebdo accomplices, is France closer or further from closure? We'll ask about sentences for those who aided and abetted the killers, who nearly 6 years ago targeted the satirical weekly as well as a kosher supermarket in Paris and killed a municipal police officer. For over 3 months, while the court heard sometimes gut-wrenching testimony, outside there have been new attacks in France triggered by the republication of Charlie, of cartoons of the prophet, the beheading of a middle school teacher, the knife attack against a church in Nice, 2015. The whole world rallied around France with the slogan, Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie, and the promise that to tackle radicalization, we would raise consciousness about what the French call le vivre ensemble, living together with our differences. What has happened since? After all the other terror attacks that followed, French public opinion seems more entrenched in 2020 than ever. How much and what next? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the Charlie Hebdo verdict. Joining us from Paris, documentary film producer Emmanuel Lecomte, director of the 2015 documentary Je suis Charlie. Thanks for being with us. We're also in the company of attorney Philippe Cohen, the founder of the NGO Respect Zone, which works on counter-radicalization. Welcome back to the show. From Berlin, a counter-terror consultant, Yann Saint-Pierre, the CEO of the Modern Security Consulting Group. Nice to see you.
Happy to be here.
And covering the trial, France 24's Sharon Gaffney at Paris Central Courts. Thanks for joining us, Sharon. The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. Sharon Gaffney, the court has put aside terror charges for 6 of the 11. In fact, what we're seeing with this verdict is a wide palette of different verdicts, but they're all guilty.
Yes, exactly. And as well as different verdicts, we've also had differing reactions from both sides since those sentences were handed down a little bit earlier this afternoon. We had, on the one hand, the lawyer for the man who was described as the main suspect during this trial, 35-year-old Ali Reza Polat. His lawyer spoke to France 24 after these sentences were handed down, and her view was that no matter what had happened here today, that her client wasn't going to be considered credible in his denial of any involvement in the preparation of the 2 attacks that the judge said today were coordinated, that at the Charlie Hebdo offices and the related synchronized attack, as it was described 2 days later at the kosher supermarket east of Paris. We had also some reaction from the families of those who died at the supermarket. The very first victim there, a young man who was just 21 years old. His father spoke to France 24 just after these sentences were handed down, and he said, yes, we had significant sentences given to 2 or 3 of the people who were on trial here. But he said some of the other sentences, they just weren't enough because, as we heard, sentences handed down between 4 years and right up to life imprisonment. But for some of the families, that's simply not enough.
Yeah, and one sentence in particular turning heads, it was the one, you might say, of all the people that were in the courtroom that all eyes were sort of turned to, which is this close accomplice, Ali Reza Polat, 30 years behind bars.
30 years behind bars. Now, they do, of course, have 10 days in order to appeal the verdict and the sentence. But yes, 30 days. Now, he was described all throughout this trial as the main suspect, as the right-hand man, and he admitted being a close friend of the gunman who attacked the kosher supermarket. But his lawyers argued that, yes, he may have been a close friend. They may have spent a lot of time together before the attacks back in January 2015. They may have sent hundreds of text messages. But their lawyer said that doesn't prove that Ali Reza Polat knew anything about what was being planned. He may have helped his friend out, and he said he owed him a drug debt, Amity Coulibaly, but he said he knew nothing about what was being planned, and that's what his lawyer maintained until the very end. And as I said, even afterwards, saying that, well, her client never really stood a chance of proving his innocence, although it wasn't up to him to prove his innocence. And that was another thing that was said during closing statements last week. The lawyer said that for Polat particularly, he was already being treated, they felt, as if he were guilty. And in the closing statements from one of the prosecuting lawyers, they actually said, well, it's not possible for this man, for Polat, to prove his innocence. And they said, well, he doesn't have to prove his innocence. He is presumed innocent, and it's up to the prosecution to prove his guilt. So this man, of course, we heard a lot about him during the trial because he contracted COVID-19. He tested positive for it, and the trial was delayed after being put back from the spring when France went into national lockdown. It was delayed again for a month when he tested positive for COVID-19. He was also very disruptive, it must be said, during the trial itself. At one point, he threatened a police officer, warning her that she would pay for what she had said when she gave evidence during the trial. He was also quite abusive to some of his co-accused and very vocal in the court, threatening, as I said, police officers and some of the accused. So,
all right. So lots on that aspect of it.
Right-hand man.
Let me turn to Emmanuel Lecomte and ask you. So, 3.5 months. It's been fraught. Sometimes it's been heart-wrenching. The testimony, the verdicts, the sentences. Do they fit the crimes?
You know, it's how can any sentence fit such a crime, the one that happened in 2015, the one that happened afterwards? I don't think any sentence can match this amount of horror, which is probably good news because we're in a democracy and we're, using justice and prison sentences instead of death in opposition to what terrorists do in the most cruel manner. But, in a way, we would have all wanted to have the Kouachi brothers to be there, Coulibaly to be present. That was not possible. So now we are, the justice has been dealing with these individuals. I am no specialist, to know if the number of years is the right amount or whatever. What seems right for the victims, I think, as far as justice is concerned, is the end of a cycle, which has been, I think, for them, extremely, extremely difficult.
And let me ask you, Emmanuel, at the outset of this trial, it was billed as one for the history books. They filmed it, which is very rare in French court proceedings for posterity. It's not the tape's not being shown now, but it will be at a later date. Has it lived up to its promise, this trial?
Well, it was disrupted by so many, unprecedented events, as, that's what 2020 was about, I guess. But with COVID-19, of course, with, first of all, the knife attack that happened outside the previous offices of Charlie Hebdo. And last but not least, with the beheading of Samuel Paty, the French professor. So I don't know if the timing was probably very complicated with all these events that happened. But yes, it will stay in history because, in a sense, I think it closes a sequence where people now have probably become more aware of what it meant to publish these cartoons, even though people are not. Even though we don't all agree, even in France, about publishing these cartoons, sadly, if you ask me, but that's the way it is. I think there's a bigger amount of people who are now ready and who understand this essential freedom that Charlie Hebdo used.
Philippe Cohen, do you agree that this trial, these 3.5 months, have raised awareness, and at least for that, it has been a positive?
Yeah, thank you, first of all, for organizing this debate on France 24. The lesson that we can take from this trial is that justice can happen in spite of all the hurdles that have been described and listed. But also what strikes us at for the NGOs who are trying to work on education, prevention, how to deter the pandemic of radicalization online, which is the fact that in this trial, there has not yet been another trial, which should be the next trial probably, which is the trial of the propagation of online hate in this circumstance, and what has been the exact role of the evangelization, shall I say, to convince all those young people to commit such crimes, which has not stopped after these events in 2015. And as you mentioned, there's been other horrendous events that have happened, meaning that we still have another trial to be started, which is the trial of the accomplice, which is the what happened in terms of evangelization and in terms of impact on the brains to commit such crimes, which can happen even tomorrow again.
And do you have hope that when there will eventually be the trial of the November 2015 attacks against the Bataclan and the such, that that will more be the trial of that proselytization of online hate?
I mean, this is exactly what we hope. Why? Because with the news that did break earlier this week, with the release of the first draft of this very important historical act, not trial but act, which is a Digital Services Act, to try to increase the liability also of the platforms, and not only the platforms are at stake, but also the users. So when you say that the next trial will be another window to work on what did really happen and how we can fight and push back against this type of proselytization of dispersion of hate, this is exactly what we need to work on, which is not only about the direct indicted persons, but also what happened for them to have been led to this time of this type of awful hatred behavior and belief.
Yann Saint-Pierre, let me ask you, because over here in France, coverage over the past 3.5 months has been extensive in the written press. We've had excellent reporting on what's going on inside of the courtroom. Those that need convincing that, when you're helping out a friend, that can lead to terrible things. Do you think they paid attention to that coverage?
Absolutely. I think, taking the various aspects of that trial and its coverage, I think, and the sentences especially, going down the line saying, look, helping a friend, supporting in any way, shape, or form will create consequences. And I think that's the sense, and I fully agree with one of the previous speakers saying, the sentences, emotionally speaking, never seem to be enough, whether it's from a security perspective, from a victim perspective. However, what we saw today with those sentences is exactly sending this message that there's no such thing as a small fish anymore, regardless of where in the food chain, in the chain as a whole, where you're involved. And I think this is exactly this awareness that's being sent, is that no longer is it possible to say, well, I didn't know, but he's a close friend. We had long discussions, but I wasn't aware, or any type of other more passive and less active involvement in these types of plans and attacks, and whether for terrorism or extremism as a whole. And therefore, I think this created a certain degree of awareness, and we'll see how it goes once the sentences have gone into appeal, and if they'll be maintained, that could have an effect as to how that affects the dynamic of support and its development as well.
And yeah, just to remind our viewers, 14 guilty verdicts, the 3 stiffest sentences handed down to the 3 defendants who weren't in the box, tried in absentia. They include the wife of the kosher supermarket killer, Hayat Boumediene is her name. She's believed to still be alive somewhere, perhaps in Syria or Iraq. We don't know for sure. Your thoughts on the fact that, well, those 3 sentences in absentia, what they mean?
Well, they're symbolic, of course. It would any trial of that size, of that importance, you want your perpetrators, your accused, to be in the box. However, as was the case with many other terrorism-related trials in France, especially those related to either Al Qaeda or Islamic State, many of those trials have been held, and the sentences have occurred in absentia. So it's more about the symbolism of it all. Nonetheless, it's a sign to say nobody will escape sentencing. Everybody will experience due process, will go through a trial, whether you're dead or you're still alive and running away. Everybody from the top down will be prosecuted duly. And I think it's an important message, even if it does appear weak and more symbolic, but it's an important symbol.
And before we go to the break, Emmanuel Lecomte, your reaction to what Sharon Gaffney was reporting at the outset, which is the defendants, especially, we heard from Ali Riza Polat's lawyer saying, I didn't know. I was just helping him out.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's hard for me. I mean, to be honest, it's hard for me to even think about them or even put myself, in their shoes, or even to consider what what excuses they would have. I was with my work as a director, I was always much more interested in what the victims had to say, of the truly innocent people, in this story, not the ones who are trying to say right now they're innocent, they haven't done anything. I'm talking about those who have been killed, those who have been injured, and the families who now, are left with holes in the family pictures. And I think that's the most important thing. The what they had to say. And the possibility they had to voice their frustration, their depression, their fears after this horrible attack. So for me, what small fish can say about how they were moving in the pond is not really relevant.
All right, we said that it was sometimes fraught during testimony in this trial. It's also been fraught for France as a whole these past 3.5 months. We're going to talk about that when we come back. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. And we're talking on the day that verdicts have been handed down in the January 2015 attacks here in Paris that targeted satirical weekly Charlie Hebdo, as well as kosher supermarkets, and killing also a municipal policewoman during those harrowing 4 days in the French capital back in 2015. The trial lasting 3.5 months. Guilty verdicts for 14 defendants, 11 of them in the box. We're talking about it with documentary film producer Emmanuel Lecomte, director of the documentary Je suis Charlie, attorney Philip Cohen, founder of the NGO Respect Zone, from Berlin, counter-terror consultant Yann Saint-Pierre is with us, the CEO of Mozicon, the consulting group, and France 24's Sharon Gaffney, who is covering the trial. Now, an attack on the former headquarters, we've seen that during these 3.5 months, a lot has happened. And we had an attack on the former headquarters of Charlie Hebdo, a stabbing spree in Nice Cathedral, and the beheading of a Paris area middle school teacher who'd taught a civics class where he showed cartoons of the prophet, the murder of Samuel Paty rocking this nation.
Samuel Paty est devenu vendredi le visage de la République, de notre volonté de briser les terroristes, de réduire les islamistes, de vivre comme une communauté de citoyens libres dans notre pays, le visage de notre détermination à comprendre, à apprendre, à continuer d'enseigner, à être libre.
Covering the events there at Paris Central Courts, Sharon Gaffney, you get the sense that Yeah, there was the concomitant, right? The beginning of the trial and Charlie Hebdo's decision to republish those cartoons of the prophet that seemed to have had a direct link to that new spate of attacks. The feeling that what was going on inside the courtroom had sort of this ripple effect now outside.
Well, the trial didn't really go into much about what was happening currently in France. Of course, yes, the cartoons the caricatures republished on the first day of the trial, but we had, just in terms of what was happening at the magazine, we heard testimony from the current editor of the Charlie Hebdo magazine, and he said even within days of the attack he was torn between the necessity of going on and continuing to publish the magazine after what had happened, being torn between that and his own grief and despair at having lost his friends and colleagues in that attack. And he told the court about having to step over their bodies when he left the courtroom. So we didn't hear an awful lot about what's happening currently in France. Of course, this trial, it's almost 6 years ago now, heading into the 6th anniversary in January. We heard a lot, though, about the symbolism of what happened. The lawyer, for example, for the magazine, he's actually been a lawyer with Charlie Hebdo for 23 years and describes the people who died that day and the survivors as his friends. Now, he spoke about the importance of the trial being seen as not just a trial in itself. He said that this trial wasn't like other trials, that the alleged offences weren't like other offences, and that the symbolism of what happened really had to be taken into account. He's spoken since the sentences were handed down, since the verdicts were delivered, and he spoke again about how this trial, it's not been about seeking vengeance. What he wanted, what the other survivors wanted, what the families of the dead wanted was answers. And I suppose some of them feel that they haven't quite received those answers. But he said it's been a very difficult process, but one that was absolutely necessary in his view, and also in the view of the people who did come here to give evidence. It was very difficult for them, but they felt that it was important to express how the attacks had affected them and their loved ones. Not everybody, obviously, who was affected felt strong enough or able to come here to give evidence. Others were in fear of retribution, in fact, if they did come here. But those who did, they felt it was very important to put that across, particularly given as the trial, as you say, it's being filmed for the French National Archives.
Philippe Cohen, to bear witness, to make sense of what happened 6 years ago, did that message that you heard Sharon describe the victims say, did it get a little bit lost with this new spate of attacks?
Exactly, and I'm really glad that Mr. Lecomte and the team has been able to get access to this exceptional authorization to be able to to capture and to film and to keep it for the future generation. My hope is that we are going to be able to to enjoy the ability to use some of the footage in class as well, and to make sure that, as you expressed before, that the feelings and the viewpoint of the victims will at least and at last be heard. What I note also from this trial is a complete absence of empathy from the accused and the indicted person. There has been a complete lack of sense of recognition from everything that we have read and observed, and this does mean a lot in terms of what is left in the education domain after this trial and the next ones.
And Philippe, let me ask you on this. The new attacks we've seen during the trial, the one at the former headquarters, the attack on Nice Cathedral, the beheading of Samuel Paty, is it because of the republishing of the cartoons?
No, I think it's much more than that. We are at war, and the war is also on the internet in terms of propaganda, and some persons are more exposed and more able to be influenced by messages that are hated and full of calls for murders. And what we have seen is that there is a real sense of what is the right message vis-a-vis this type of attack and propaganda. And when you mentioned the fact that during the trial, in front of the headquarters of Charlie, there has been this attack with a large knife. This does show that we need to work on the ground, not only in the courtroom, but also on the ground, meaning with the youngsters, with the generation, with the educators, with the parents as well. And everything has to be really started in this domain, which is why we also called for more ways for platforms to be able to take more the liability of the fact that they've been the vehicle for this type of propaganda. And one of the proposals that we're making vis-a-vis the EU Commission Act, which is being on the table right now, is to have a kind of if you pollute, you have to pay your tax as a polluter, and as a polluter, and the idea would be to measure the level of hate, translate it into a tax that would be able to fund the educative tools that we all need to try to reduce what you just mentioned.
Yann Saint-Pierre, weren't these all the topics we were discussing, sadly, 5.5 years ago?
Absolutely, and that's the thing, is that very often, we've, as you mentioned, we had this discussion, and we're always talking about versatility of understanding the entire process that leads to radicalization, that leads to the ideas of acting violently, politically speaking, into action, to the step from ideas to action, and not just dealing with it in the courts or dealing with it from a security standpoint, but it needs to be an issue as a society. And I think the more we understand that what we say, what we do as a society, each of us, each person, that will contribute to disarming a lot of Mr. Cohen was saying, the polluters will contribute to mitigate a lot of that pollution online, will go a long way. We saw it this year with a lot of the conspiracy theories, a lot of the hate coming out of various circles linked to the pandemic, and how that simply, snowballed and became worse and led to various attacks as well, not just in France, but in other regions. And therefore, yes, we have a role of responsibility, each of us as citizens.
So we have a role of responsibility, Yann. You don't hail from secularist France, but from multicultural Canada. So let me ask you, was it right to republish those cartoons of the Prophet? Or was that irresponsible?
I think it was unnecessary. However, I can understand the position of Charlie Hebdo editors saying this is a way for us to move forward as well. It's a very emotional aspect. However, I think it was, again, unnecessary. I think it did act as a catalyst, not to say that it was the trigger, but it did act as a catalyst for what followed over the next 6 to 8 weeks after they were published. And therefore, I think the editors of Charlie Hebdo, once they made that decision, it had to be made with the awareness that it could indeed, unfortunately, lead to further attacks, and that, when we talk about freedom of expression, that the awareness of saying, what could the consequences be of what I'm saying be? I think that needs to play a big role in the discussion as well. And I'd like to say that Canada works so well and multicultural and so on, but we struggle with these issues as well. I think there's something to be said about tolerance rather than acceptance. And I think France is coming to terms with that as well. And therefore, it's a very emotional issue, but that is very much linked to what we understand from consequences of our actions and our words.
Emmanuel Lecomte, whether we're talking about jihadists or white supremacists, radicals seem to want a world which is black and white, where there's two sides and it's very polarized. Would you say that France, at the end of this trial, is more polarized, more entrenched than it was on opening day?
I don't think so. No, I think we're still. People still have their reservations with regards to what Charlie Hebdo did. People are still horrified about what people can do when someone makes a cartoon. I think it's still very much mixed. But what I am kind of concerned with is to still imagine right now, even with the question you asked, which I understand, when you were saying, do we think that the republishing of the cartoons, caused the attack in a sense? That has always been the sort of accusation we made to Charlie Hebdo. Let us not forget that this whole cycle of events started in 2004, when a director, Theo van Gogh, in Holland, made a film just criticizing, an art film criticizing, the domination of womanhood in Islam. He was killed for that, and it's after that that the Jyllands-Posten, the Danish newspaper, made this set of cartoons. I mean, asked for people contributions to make this set of cartoons to say, okay, we're just going to test freedom of expression. This is a hot topic, evidently. Will people be okay to talk about it? And after that, Charlie Hebdo decided to republish him, and everything went on and on. The 2007 trial, the 2011, fire in Charlie Hebdo's offices, and each time people were saying, "Oh, well, maybe you should stop publishing. Maybe it's because you're showing little drawings with little guys. That's probably why we have so much violence in this society." I think this is completely crazy to assume that. What we have to be aware of is that there is indeed a war. I agree with Mr. Cohen. I don't know if we are waging that war, but I am definitely sure that this war has been declared to us. That is very clear. The Jews, French Jews, have been taken, as victims. Policemen, journalists, teachers, priests. I mean, this is a very determined, organized attack, one by one, trying to aim at everything that makes the core of a republic. And so I think we have to really realize that whatever Charlie Hebdo does, if Charlie Hebdo publishes or not is not a question. It should be able to publish without any problem, and without people asking this question. I think the real question is, what does a republic do when war has been declared?
And they have acted, Emmanuel. They've unveiled this law on separatism, which is aimed at radical Islam. There have been measures announced by the government. We did a whole debate on it last week. This new draft bill that's being done. Again, this talk of it being a war, is that the right way to approach it?
Well, it is for me very clear again that what happened in the Bataclan is an act of war. It is an act of war, and it is, and all the other attacks, that have been perpetrated are aimed at this same objective, which is to have us doubt of our institutions, of our values, of our laws, and of our way of life. And I really think that France is an exception in the world, in the way it deals with identity, in the way it deals with belief, with not believing, with secularism. It is a very odd thing for the whole world to come to grip with. I understand, but it also needs to be understood that it is a very powerful tool. France is having a lot of problems with its identity. I'm not saying everything is perfect. Far from that. There's many problems. But I think the most dangerous reaction would be to say, okay, let's curb our freedom of expression and that use another type of identity politics. I don't think that would be the good possibility.
Sharon Gaffney, covering this trial, do you get the sense that this debate on secularism that's very French has seeped into it once again?
The debate on secularism seeped into the trial. Well, from what we've seen from the reaction from the lawyers, from the 200 civil parties who were involved in this case, from the families of the people who died, from the survivors, they're really focused on this particular trial on what actually happened to their loved ones, to the people that they worked with, to their former colleagues. And the issue of secularism, as is debated in France right now, I think what was more important to them was to put forward what actually happened to the people that they loved who were killed during those 3 days when France really as a nation and right across the world people were outraged by what had happened. And of course it was seen back then as not just an attack on France, on French values, on the French state, but on, as you say, the freedom of expression and on the freedom of thought. So in terms of secularism, it wasn't really something that was discussed during this trial. It was really all about what happened specifically almost 6 years ago, back in January 2015. And I think it was just important for the people who gave their testimony, dignified, emotional testimony, to focus on that rather than the wider issues, what else was happening in France, the debate ongoing over secularism, and even the debate over the publication of the caricatures. It was just very important for them to focus on what actually happened
on
to
the
their
matters
loved
of the
ones,
trial
to their
itself.
former colleagues.
And if you were in a bubble inside of Paris Central Courts for 3.5 months and you came out of it now, you would hear that perhaps the tone has grown slightly more caustic on these matters, where this rolling out of this bill on about the values of the Republic to combat radical Islam. And one of the staunchest defenders of laïcité, secularism, as the French see it, has been the education minister. In October, he was interviewed and took aim at intellectuals that Jean-Michel Blanquer says are prone to what he calls Islamo-leftism.
Ce qu'on appelle communément l'islamo-gauchisme fait des ravages. Il fait des ravages à l'université, il fait des ravages quand une organisation comme l'UNEF cède à ce type de choses. Il fait des ravages quand dans les rangs de la France insoumise, vous avez des gens qui sont tout simplement de ce courant-là et s'affichent comme tels. Et donc, tout simplement, favorise une idéologie qui ensuite, de loin en loin, mène évidemment au pire.
Philippe Cohen, there is this argument that, you know, what the jihadists were attacking was our right to debate and to be different. Do you feel as though the current political discourse, the tone that you're hearing in France, is positive or a negative?
Well, first of all, I think that we should try to extract ourselves from was it right or not to republish the Charlie caricature, and is there any French specific issue with freedom of speech, with this kind of bipolarization vis-à-vis Islam? You know, there's a recent slaughters and attacks that were perpetrated in Austria, in Mozambique with Boko Haram, in Nigeria with Al-Qaeda as well. You know, they were awful, and these are countries where, you know, there is no secularism, no one reads Charlie, there is no, you know, where blasphemy is part of the incrimination. So I think that it's quite important what has just been said by the Ministry of Education, which is that we should try to really stop, especially in France, to play guilty with, you know, the fact that we like parody, we like humor, we like secularism. I think, as we say, this is a real war against freedom of speech, against everything that we like here, you know, in terms of way of life, you know, the freedom to think, the freedom to be a woman, the freedom to be different, for instance, and the ability to claim that in all the countries where there is room for difference needs to be protected. And the idea is to maybe try to put out of focus there are French particularism, as explained by my predecessor, but not to the point to make this kind of glowing glass on the French specificity, where there would be some reasons to attack France more than any other places. So to answer to your question, I think that we are really at the edge of trying to say what is it that we want to defend, and not only in France, but as a kind of community of freedom nations.
So, as you just heard Yann Saint-Pierre, there are elements here that are specific to France, and then when you're talking about counterterrorism, things that are global. And the most recent example is this kidnapping of those boys in northern Nigeria. Let me ask you, just as a closing word here, in 6 years, have we gotten better at what we said at the outset, the vivre ensemble, the living together, which is what many describe as the best way to counter radical thought?
Unfortunately, I don't think we haven't. I think there's a difference that counterterrorism approaches, philosophies, means have improved, have changed. However, as a society or as societies, we're more divided than ever. And I think we're very far from this vivre ensemble. I think we're very far from this living together. And I think the recent years in politics, the recent divisions, the entire debates are showing this. And I think, to use the American parallel here, we are entering a phase where we need to confront ourselves with the images in the mirror, but also begin a healing process where we need to have honest, truthful exchanges with one another to know what we're going. Mr. Lecomte spoke about identity. I think we are reshaping our identities to match the changes in the world in the last few decades. I think this reassessment is going to create the vivre ensemble. But for now, in 6 years, I think we'll be, unfortunately, still having this discussion.
All right. I want to thank you so much, Yann Saint-Pierre, for joining us. I want to thank Emmanuel Lecomte, Philippe Cohen. I want to thank Sharon Gaffney, who joined us from Paris Central Courts. And thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.